listening to the podcast From Israelite to Jew with Michael Sadlow. Episode 2, The Religion of Israel. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 586 BCE would initiate the long and slow transformation of Israelite religion into what would become, about 600 years later, the beginning of both Christianity and Judaism as we now know them. This podcast series focuses on this formative period, beginning with the building of the Second Temple around 520 BCE. To fully appreciate this development, though, we need a baseline, at least a rudimentary sense of the Israelite religion that would be transformed. In the last episode, I dealt with one preliminary matter, an introduction to the academic study of religion, the approach that I take here and throughout the series, and some personal thoughts on how this approach can add value to our lives. This episode takes up a more substantive preliminary matter, the religion of Israel in 586 BCE and before. What exactly was the relationship between the religion reflected in most biblical books, especially the Torah, and that practiced by the Jews of the Second Temple period? How were they both continuous and discontinuous? In this episode, I will focus on the issues of identity, the role of the sacrificial cult, especially as practiced in the Jerusalem temple, and authority, as these issues played out in ancient Israelite religion. In order to properly appreciate Israelite religion, though, we must first take a step back and briefly discuss our sources. How do we know what we think we know? The fact of the matter is that we know a lot less than we would like to. Our main source for studying Israelite religion is the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. In another podcast episode, I will discuss in more depth the Hebrew Bible. Here, though, it is necessary to note how difficult it is to extract historical data from the Bible. As it presently exists, the Hebrew Bible contains just a tiny percentage of what must have been the religious literature of the Israelites. These books were included in the Bible for a variety of reasons, but we can be sure that they do not always represent the religious beliefs and practices of most Israelites, or even of those in power. Moreover, it is clear that several of these books are composite documents. The book of Isaiah, for example, has at least 2 and probably 3 authors who date from very different periods. The Pentateuch, or Torah, is widely considered to be comprised of at least 4 different sources that originate over a 400-year period in different geographical centers. The religion of Israel changed over time, and the sparse and scattered literary sources give us very little insight into these diachronic changes. The archaeological evidence is of some, but also very limited help. It suggests, for example, that Israelites avoided consuming pork, and that they frequently possessed small cult figurines. Much beyond this, though, inevitably gets complicated. 2 famous archaeological finds, for example, illustrate this complexity. Both can be seen in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The first is a small ivory figurine of a pomegranate. Discovered in 1979, the pomegranate had an inscription that appears to read, "Belonging to the temple of Yahweh, holy to the priests." This, then, appears to be the only archaeological discovery connected to the first temple. Except it isn't, or at least not definitively. The inscription is a forgery, inscribed on what probably, or what at least might be, a genuinely ancient artifact. Where this artifact was from, though, and how it was used remains mysterious. A second tantalizing object is an ancient silver scroll that contains what appears to be the priestly benediction of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. The scroll probably dates to 600 BCE and appears to be an amulet. Is this then an amulet that drew from a real priestly benediction that was already in Scripture? Or did the text originate in magical practices, only to be tamed by the authors of the biblical text? Did priests ever actually recite this? If so, when and to whom? The small piece of metal does not answer these questions. My point is that any reconstruction of early Israelite religion must remain incomplete. The little evidence that does remain, as we will see, is sometimes contradictory, which might speak either to change through time, different practices in different regions, or minority opinions. We simply often do not know. One of the most sensitive subjects about which we know little is the early history of Israel. This is, fortunately for me, not the place to discuss Israelite origins. Suffice it to say that the historical accounts of the Torah are, at minimum, highly suspect. Our historical footing gets somewhat surer with the reign of King David, although David's own existence is poorly attested. Sometime around 1000 BCE, David appears to have ruled over an expanding, but still relatively small kingdom that was centered in Jerusalem. It was in David's and his son's Solomon's kingdoms that Israelite identity, if not necessarily created, was significantly reinforced. Solomon constructed the first temple, which was to serve as the central cultic place of all of Israel. Such unity, if ever achieved, was short-lived. Upon Solomon's death, around 938 BCE, his kingdom split into a northern and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, also known as the House of Israel during this period, constructed its own cultic centers at Beth El and Dan. The northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians in 721 BCE, and many of its inhabitants fled south to Judah, greatly increasing the population of Jerusalem. These people, northern and southern, living together in Jerusalem and its environs, were known by various names. Hebrew appears to be an early designation, and Israel soon came to denote this entire community. Surprisingly, they never seem to call themselves Judeans or Jews. The Hebrew word for Jew, in fact, only appears in the relatively late Book of Esther, which purports to have been authored in Persia. While both northerners and southerners, for the most part, pledged their adherence to the same God, it was probably during this period that there began to emerge a single national consciousness focused around the powerful historical narrative of the Exodus from Egypt. Their God was not only mighty, but had created a nation out of them as they were redeemed from bondage. Every self-identified group of human beings creates for themselves some story, some narrative of identification. It might be a historical narrative of origins. Most modern nations have a number of such narratives, and while they may sometimes compete, usually it is only one or a couple that dominate that nation's sense of itself. Sometimes a community has a spiritual narrative, a sense that they were chosen by the divine. Sometimes the narrative is biological. The members of a family, for example, may share descent, even if their lives have taken very different paths. Whether or not the narrative is objectively true, at least in the literal historical sense that we usually ascribe to the word, is to a great degree irrelevant. Histories create imagined communities, stories that their members subscribe to and share with others in their group. It doesn't much matter whether things really happen the way that the story says they did. Even narratives based on biology are tricky. They are almost always flexible enough to include people who come from the outside, adoptees, for example. The Israelite narrative of identity, as it finally emerges in the Bible, pulls off a hat trick. Israelites not only shared a historical path, they also share a divinely granted destiny. And they will do so as family, as one that began with the single couple of Abraham and Sarah, and 2 generations later began to expand rapidly with the 12 sons of Jacob, or Israel, as he would be renamed. The Israelite narrative of identity is really three narratives intertwined with each other, one of biology, one of shared historical experience, and one of divine destiny. As we will see throughout this podcast series, different later Jewish communities would emphasize whichever one of these strands that they found most fitting. The narrative that reflects the Israelite belief in their God is no less complex than that of their origins. We are mostly used to the idea that the Israelites were, or at least supposed to be, staunch monotheists, worshippers of only a single, all-powerful and all-knowing God, a good God, involved in their historical and personal fortunes. All of these traits can indeed be found in the Bible. But at the same time, the Bible reveals strains of a far more complex understanding of God. Take, for example, God's seeming cluelessness in the episode of Adam and Eve. God is presented as rummaging around the Garden of Eden, calling out for Adam. Or God's repeated tantrums in the books of Exodus and Numbers, followed by his calming, hardly consistent with the notion of God as the unmoved mover, popularized by Maimonides and later Hermann Cohen. Most striking, though, is the idea of monotheism. The radical monotheism onto which later Jews would latch is not the only voice in the Bible. Who is like you among the gods? Exodus 15:11 declares. Who is this Satan against whom God wages in the book of Job? Even the paradigmatic statement of Jewish faith, the Shema, seems to have polytheistic overtones. Hear, Israel, Moses says in Deuteronomy 6:4. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Could there be an implication here that other, perfectly legitimate gods existed? They just aren't ours? The point is not that there were good monotheistic Israelites and bad idol-worshipping ones. While that was, of course, true, at least in the mind of the ancient Israelites, or some of the ancient Israelites, there was considerable latitude in what constituted of legitimate monotheistic belief. Clearly, before 722 BCE, the Northerners thought that it was perfectly acceptable to worship the God of Israel at different cult sites, at which were erected, according to many scholars, golden bulls. Even well after 722, the radical monotheists did not offer the only official way of understanding God. Most Israelites, though, did believe that the God of Israel desired sacrifice, and most ultimately came to the conclusion that the most legitimate place to offer sacrifices was the temple in Jerusalem. For Israelites, as for their neighbors in the ancient Near East, sacrifice was the natural way to pay homage to their God. Sacrifices kept God happy, and when God was happy, the community would enjoy safety and divine beneficence. It is worth emphasizing here both the physical, literal nature of sacrifice, as well as the assumptions upon which it was based. Sacrifice was not strictly spiritual or metaphorical. Most frequently, it involved slaughtering an animal by slitting its neck, allowing its blood to drain, butchering the animal, roasting the flesh on an open fire, and then consuming it. It also involved giving wine and produce to the priests, which they would consume together with the meat. God, then, does not eat the meat, but God does enjoy the smell of the roast. It is this pleasing odor that satisfies God, along with the gifts given to and consumed by the priests. The Israelites seem to have envisioned an impermeable barrier between the earth and the heavens, God's abode. Only above the smoking flesh of the sacrifice was there an opening, a window, through which God received the offerings and prayers, and in return gave back to humans. The intention and behavior of those who sacrificed was certainly relevant, but for most Israelites, at most times, the sacrifice itself was the most important act in appeasing God. The temple, then, was primarily a slaughterhouse. It must have been filled with noise and smells of animals, its floors slippery with blood, the smell of barbecue constant throughout the entire city. However this strikes us, for most Israelites, this would have been not only normal but desired. It meant that their God was happy. No time would this have been more obvious than during the 3 pilgrimage festivals. According to the Bible, all Israelites were to go to the temple 3 times each year, each time bringing sacrificial offerings. The 3 holidays are Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, or, as they are known in Hebrew, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. On the one hand, it is unlikely that most Israelites who lived any significant distance from the temple would have made this trip with any regularity. On the other hand, between 722 and the fall of the temple in 586, most Israelites probably did live within a day or 2 trek to the temple. Regardless, during these festivals, business at the temple undoubtedly would have increased dramatically as Israelites streamed into the temple with their animals. If the temple was largely a slaughterhouse, its butchers were the priests. Priests, thought to have been biologically descended from Moses' brother Aaron, played a critical role. They were the primary religious authorities of Israel. The priests were responsible for the sacrifices upon which natural and individual well-being depended. Their power came not from exceptional learning or merit, but as a matter of descent and office. No matter. They were Israel's religious authorities. They offered no counseling services and officiated at no life cycle events. They did their job running the temple service, and on behalf of God accepted and ate the offerings of the Israelites. Contact between God and the Israelites occurred mainly through the act of sacrifice as mediated by the priest. On occasion, though, it could also happen more directly via the prophet. The prophet, like the priest, was usually a temple functionary, and it was through the prophet that God's will could be known more directly. The temple's prophet functioned much like an ancient oracle. It was institutionalized, questions could be submitted to it, and the answers were often poetic, if not completely obscure. In contrast to the priests, whose entire raison d'etre was linked to the temple, prophets also existed outside of the temple, sometimes as anti-establishment figures. These are the prophets whose works are preserved in the Bible, those who railed against contemporary practices of the temple. On one level, these prophets can be seen as using prophecy as a source of authority to challenge that of the priests. Priests, though, would have had their own prophets on their side, and the great biblical prophets, like Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos, ultimately would have had little impact on the practices of their time. Before discussing and concluding with the third source of Israelite religious authority, that of the scribes, I want to emphasize that I've largely been discussing religious institutions. We have little direct knowledge of the practices and beliefs of ordinary Israelites, especially minority groups, such as slaves and women and the poor. We do know that they, like almost all people prior to the modern period, did not neatly divide the world into spheres that they labeled religious and secular, with the former practices confined to the Jerusalem temple. Religion suffused their lives, and many of the biblical precepts reflect common understandings and domestic practices. It is reasonable to suppose that the ethical codes of the Bible, which largely resemble those of other cultures in the ancient Near East, reflect at least a set of popular ideals, even if in their actual practice people, just like today, often fell short. Israelites also had a way of serving and supplicating their God that did not depend on the temple. They most likely restrained from work on the Sabbath, however they might have defined work. They restrained from eating pork, and probably several of the other animals prescribed in the book of Leviticus. They prayed, although except in times of communal fasts, this was probably not done in any organized fashion or according to any established liturgy. Maybe they wore fringes on their garments. They most certainly circumcised their sons. Although they were not the only people in the region to do so, this did become an important sign of communal identity as an Israelite. They did not appear to have other distinctive life cycle rituals or practices. Some probably possessed cultic objects, but the extent of such practices, not to mention their tolerance, is far from clear. We know about most of these practices from texts, and texts in turn were authored and controlled by scribes, who constituted the third and probably most minor source of religious authority in ancient Israel. Authority came from the traditions of priests and the statements of prophets, not from the interpretation of texts. In future episodes of this podcast, I will argue that one of the major discontinuities between the Israelites and the later Jews is the rise of a written text, the Torah, as an independent source of authority, and the control of its interpretation by scribes. The discontinuity, though, is not absolute. There were scribes in ancient Israel who worked with and manipulated texts. One can see their work already in the Bible. Let me mention but 3 fascinating examples. The book of Exodus first mentions the festival of Passover and the ritual at its heart, the Passover offering. Each family was to slaughter an unblemished lamb, and, as Exodus chapter 12, verses 8 to 9 explain, they shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw, or cooked in any way with water, but roasted, heads, legs, and entrails, over the fire. The assumption of this passage is that this is a family affair. Its emphasis is clearly on the mode of cooking. The lamb must be roasted over the fire. Now compare Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 5 to 7. You are not permitted to slaughter the Passover sacrifice in any of the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. There and there alone shall you slaughter the Passover sacrifice. In the evening, at sundown, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall boil and eat it at the place where the Lord your God will choose, and in the morning you may start back on your journey home. This passage fundamentally differs from the one in Exodus. The assumption is now that this ritual is connected to the central authority of the temple. More puzzling, the prescribed mode of cooking seems to be in direct contradiction with Exodus. Now the lamb is not to be roasted, but boiled. Modern scholars see this contradiction as evidence of the documentary hypothesis. 2 different sources understand Passover differently. Whether this is historically true, the contradiction cannot simply be wished away. Some of the most ancient readers of the Torah themselves picked up on it. Hence, the scribal author of 2 Chronicles, chapter 35, verse 13, wrote that they boiled the Passover sacrifice in fire, preferring obfuscation to contradiction. My second example also concerns an Israelite festival, this time tabernacles or Sukkot. According to Leviticus 23, the Israelites are to take branches of various trees, and according to verse 40, rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. The verse, of course, is puzzling. How do you rejoice with vegetation? Leviticus does not tell us, instead going on to command the Israelites to dwell in booths for the duration of the festival. Again, it was a later scribe who picked up on the problem. Ezra, a scribe whom we will get to know much better in a few episodes, commands the people to take these branches and use them to build their booths. Ezra does not know about the later Jewish practice of shaking a lulav and etrog. For him, rejoicing, found in Leviticus, must link to the building and living in the booths. If these two examples represent the scribal manipulation of ritual, my last example turns to belief. In Exodus, as God descends on the mountain where Moses stands waiting with 2 carved tablets, God declares, the Lord, God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generation. The passage is clear. God can punish me because of something that my long-deceased great-grandparents did, despite my perfect innocence. This understanding of divine justice might, indeed perhaps should, make us squirm. It goes directly against our conception of justice. Is it really just that someone dies in recompense for the sins of an ancestor? Again, though, the ancients themselves were bothered by precisely the same problem. As Ezekiel 18, verse 20, flatly states, the person who sins, he alone shall die. A child shall not share the burden of a parent's guilt, nor shall a parent share the burden of a child's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous shall be accounted to him alone, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be accounted to him alone. The scribal author of Ezekiel revised the theological premise of Exodus. In contemporary Jewish liturgy, by the way, the first part of the Exodus passage appears, but it breaks off after the statement about God forgiving sin. The statement about visiting the sin on the children and the children's children is omitted. It is worth stating explicitly what is implicit in these examples. Later scribes responded to and revised earlier materials, whether due to perceived contradictions, ambiguities, or moral problems that they discerned in the texts. It is also worth noting that all 3 examples appear in relatively late sources, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Ezekiel. All are thought to date from after the destruction of the first temple. What we see in these examples, then, is the incipient beginning of a trend in which, as the authority of a sacred text increases, so too does the authority of those who claim to be that text's authentic interpreters. The transformation from Israelite religion to Judaism is in no small part the transition from a religion centered on the temple to one centered on the Torah. And it is the Bible itself that provides the first signs of this transformation. This transformation began to occur not as some natural predetermined plan, nor as a spiritual evolution. Rather, it began as the result of a fantastic military and political blunder on the part of the Israelite rulers in the 6th century BCE. It is to that blunder and its consequences that we will turn in the next episode. Podcast From Israelite to Jew by Michael Sadlow. You can find more information about the podcast at www.mlsadlow.com in the blog and public education pages. I welcome your comments. The original music is by Neil Ginsberg with vocals by Michelle Tettenbaum. Thank you for listening.